Good afternoon and welcome to this session on integrating workplace experiences. That is how we come to integrate the experiences that students have in workplaces with those in educational settings. And I know that in the Francophone world, this is sometimes referred to as alternance. Now, I want to draw upon the processes and outcomes of a couple of projects. Principally, there was one which was undertaken in Australia across 6 Australian universities and comprised 20 projects. And you'll have received a copy of this document, which is about guidelines for how we come to integrate experiences in the workplace with those in the educational settings. So, yeah, as I've said, this was a research project that had a series of projects occurring across different universities in different disciplines. And the process was developmental, that we engaged, we shared, we provided and shared findings to support these projects across those universities. And this was undertaken through meetings, video conferences, and dialogue forums, a bit like the kind of session we're having now to share from each other. And why is there this focus now on work integrated education or work integrated learning, sometimes referred to as alternance? Well, certainly there's a growing interest in engaging students in work experience, and we've discussed that earlier in the course. Secondly, there's growing demands from outside of education, from employers, from professional bodies, from unions, from governments, and from students themselves to have work experiences. And much of that is associated with trying to ensure that when students graduate, they are job ready, that is, able to move from their studies effectively into workplaces. And the other reason is that workplaces often provide experiences that simply cannot be found in educational institutions, and that workplaces provide particular experiences to support occupational development, the development of occupational skills, but also those skills associated with work readiness, of understanding what paid work is about and understanding how people need to engage effectively in work activities. I think it's important, however, to distinguish between work integrated education and work integrated learning, because these two terms have come to be used synonymously, that is, in the same way. And there's a big issue here, and that is just like lifelong learning and lifelong education have been seen as being the same, that is highly problematic, because lifelong education is about the intentional experiences provided through educational programs, and lifelong learning is something that occurs across our lives, within but mainly outside of educational programs. So I think it's important to distinguish between work integrated education, which is the provision of experiences from which individuals are intended to learn particular kinds of knowledge. And this encompasses what is referred to as the intended and enacted curriculum, because when educational provisions are designed and enacted, they're done for intentional purposes to achieve particular outcomes. Then we have work integrated learning, which is how individuals come to engage with the experiences they have in both the workplace and the educational setting, and make sense of those experiences, make meaning out of those experiences, and in some sense reconcile the two sets of experiences to draw upon what they know. So whereas work integrated education is an institutional fact, it comes from society, work integrated learning is a personal fact. It's how we as people make sense of those experiences. So some of the key findings from this project were that just providing workplace experiences is insufficient. They need to be augmented in some way, supported and enriched in some way. And that students' readiness, their ability to engage, was important in terms of their interest, being realistic, but also the kind of capacities that they had to do something helpful and to engage effectively in the workplace was important. And this then also underlined the importance of providing and managing experiences for students who are time jealous. Now, I can't speak to what occurs elsewhere, but in Australia, higher education students are constantly balancing study commitments with paid part-time work commitments, with social commitments. And what we found in this study is that students aren't time poor, that is, I don't have sufficient time, but they're actually time jealous. They make decisions about how they allocate their time and what they give effort to. And if an activity isn't deemed to be worth giving effort to, they won't engage with it, with any kind of effort. And also, this underlined the whole importance of the experience curriculum, how students come to construe and construct knowledge from the experience they have. What students also said, because of that in some sense, that incremental exposure to practice-based experiences was preferred. So rather than being thrust into a workplace situation that they might find overwhelming, and rather than that they would be guided and incremental participation in the workplace. For instance, they might firstly observe workplace activities before actively engaging in them. And so from this, it was seen the importance of preparing students before they go into the workplace, providing some kind of support during their workplace experiences, and then after they've had those experiences, assist connecting those experiences to what they are seeking to learn through their programs. So here I want to give a consideration to some concepts, and these are the intended and acting experience curriculum, which I'll just rehearse again, and then a consideration of pedagogic curriculum practices first of all, and then a series of considerations of pedagogic practices that occur before, during, and after the student's practicum experiences. So definitional matters. As I've referred to earlier, intended curriculum, that is what is intended to occur through educational programs, and these are normally shaped by what is referred to as intended outcomes, educational outcomes. And then there's the enacted curriculum, and that is the enactment of the experiences depending upon a whole set of factors such as available resources, available experiences, the expertise of teachers, the experiences in the workplace, etc., etc. And then there's the experience curriculum, that is students' engagement with and learning from those experiences. So these are the ones that I've mentioned earlier and are rehearsed here. Pedagogies are ways in which learning experiences can be augmented or enriched in some way to improve their learning potential. And this includes teacherly engagement, but also the kind of providing particular experiences and the sequencing of experiences, providing interactions and the kind of interactions that occur. And then finally, the important concept of personal epistemologies. And this is the basis by which individuals come to construe and construct knowledge from what they experience. And I think it's very important to distinguish between an experience, something that occurs, and how people respond and engage with that experience. And that's the process of experiencing. Now, in terms of the intended curriculum, what seems to be important in trying to integrate and provide the richness of these two experiences in the workplace and in the educational setting is being clear about what is supposed to be learned, and be clear about that and be focused on that. From that, then, aligning the experiences provided for students with those outcomes. Is it, for instance, about an orientation to an occupation or an orientation to where work is conducted? Or is it about the development of specific skills? So whereas the former might be a visit to a workplace or a period of observation in a workplace, if it's about skill development, it needs to be about the development of skills, the time taken to develop those skills, to practice them, to hone them, etc. So quite different processes to achieve very different outcomes. And as I've said, the importance of aligning in some ways the duration, the time taken for those experiences with the educational purposes. So whereas an observation could be a couple of hours, even less, the development of skill takes far, far longer, and it is a far more structured set of activities and occurring over a far longer period of time. And intentionally sequencing experiences to secure and consolidate and reconcile learning experiences seem to be important. And I'll just go back to the example I used yesterday, which was of the midwifery students engaging firstly in continuity of care experiences and then going on to having clinical experiences. So a progression through a set of sequenced experiences to develop their capacities. In terms of the enacted curriculum, some key considerations here, that is what kind of experiences are provided. It is augmenting the available experience. So for instance, what might be available in terms of a workplaces in a metropolitan city, such as the one I live in, is going to be very different than the kind of experiences that are available in regional communities, small towns, away from large metropolitan centres. So different kind of experiences, and we need to take into account those different kind of opportunities. And we also need to be aware that when we think about alternance or the integration of work experiences, that it doesn't just have to come from supervised placements, that other kind of experiences can also be very important. That includes, by the way, students' paid part-time work that they engage in. And we also need to be aware of and account for students' readiness. That is, the abilities they have to engage productively in the experiences that are provided. And this is partly about their interest. Are they interested in this? And their capacities. Do they have skills that they're able to apply and engage in and learn productively from? And there also might be needs of particular groups of students. So for instance, in one of the projects, a project on social work, develop social work skills. This was a course that had many international students participating in it. In that course, in the second week of the course, the students went to social welfare settings to engage in and get experience of social work. However, many of the students in that course from overseas came from countries that didn't have a social welfare system, didn't have social workers. So they didn't have any understandings of the way that a social welfare system works, social support, its roles, or the role of social workers. And so in that case, it was important to prepare those students to enhance their readiness so that they could make sense of and learn from productively the experiences they had in the work setting. And then there's the experience curriculum. And as I've said already, students' capacities, interest, and readiness is central to their engagement in and learning in practice settings, and then reconciling those experiences with what they're engaged in their coursework, their educational programs. And many students will have concerns about how they will perform in the workplace, particularly if they're learning a particular set of occupational skills, albeit the teacher who's very concerned about first time teaching in front of a group of students, or the physiotherapy student who for the first time will be placing their hands upon patients, and they'll be judged not by their teachers, but they'll be judged by other physiotherapists. And these then raise concerns about their competence. And as I've said, that what the students suggested they wanted from these programs was early experience of the work settings in which they would need to practice, but staged engagement in those practice settings so that they could incrementally develop their capacities, but also their competence to be effective and engage and learn effectively in those work settings. And challenges to professional confidence and competence can be redressed by having group processes. So for instance, students either going into workplaces in pairs or by having focus groups where they meet with colleagues, peers, and discuss the issues that they're engaging with. Now let me move to some pedagogical considerations, how we might think about enriching these experiences. And what I'm going to suggest is that a way of thinking about this is to have a consideration of what needs to be done before the students go into the work setting, during the work setting, and then after the practice experiences. In terms of before the students go in, these are likely to be helpful to actually, for students to be orientated to for actually how they need to engage in the workplace. That, what do they need to do? How do they need to interact with others in the workplace? So setting out some criteria, setting out some understandings about their roles and responsibilities and how they need to engage with others is probably important. And clarifying expectations of what the students should be seeking to do and also what they shouldn't perhaps be doing. Now, in one healthcare setting I observed recently, one of the doctors, when a medical student came along, would say to the student, now what would you like to learn today and what would be helpful for you? But before that doctor asked the question, she also asked the student about what they'd done so far and what their experience had been. And from that then, this medical doctor, the one in charge of that emergency unit, was able to make some judgments about the way that that student or a junior doctor could be utilized so that they would learn, but also could become part of the team. That kind of medical practitioner won't always be there. And so it might be more important that the student is proactive in advising people about what they've done and also what they hope to learn from that experience. And preparing students to be active or agentic learners seems to be important because it's a different mode of learning in a practice setting than in an educational setting where there's a teacher to set out what's supposed to be achieved, how it will be achieved, and provide the experiences. So in work settings, it's more about the student, the learner, the junior practitioner being active in terms of observing what's going on, engaging with each other people, and interacting in ways which will help their learning. In some sense, the locus of the learning, the mediation of the learning becomes the responsibility more of the learner. And having the kind of procedural capacities, the ability to do something in the workplace, as I've said already, is very important so that when the student goes into the workplace, they can contribute something and they're engage in practice and learn through working with others. But also, workplaces are often contested environments, and workplaces can be very busy, and novices, students can be seen as being a nonsense. And what often happens, a nuisance, beg your pardon. And what can happen sometimes is that a student will go into the workplace and they will be told by people in the workplace, forget that rubbish you've learned at university, this is what we do here. So the students need to be prepared for that and need to be positioned so they can make judgments about the worth of what they see and whether this contests productively or contests negatively with what they've learned through their course. In terms of what might happen during practice, wherever possible, it's very helpful for novices to be guided closely by experts, as was discussed earlier in the course. And it's also important, as we've already discussed, to actually to be actively involved in pedagogically rich activities such as handovers and grand rounds, where, for instance, this is a medical setting where the medical students go around the ward with the doctors as they visit each of the patients. So actively engaging and finding ways in which they can actively engage is important. And effective peer interactions that during the practice settings, they can be very lonely environments for students. But if students can connect with each other, can support each other, they can enrich their learning experiences. And all of this now has become made so much easier with the use of mobile technology, where students can interact with each other very easily, even if they're not in the same physical space or are on the same shift or whatever. And importantly, an active and purposeful engagement by students as learners in workplace settings, and that is being proactive, being agentic in how they engage and what they seek to learn from the workplace, without, of course, making a nuisance of themselves. And after the practice experience, it's very important to facilitate the sharing and drawing upon the experience of the students. And from these projects, it seems that this is probably the most important opportunity to intervene and richly draw upon the knowledge and promote and augment the learning experience of the workplace. Because at this point in time, students have actually had the experiences. They've got something to engage and share and compare and contrast with their colleagues. And this then can be used to make explicit links between what has been taught in their course and what they experience and learn in practice settings. And all too often, it's not obvious, it's not clear. And having the opportunity to make sense of and to reconcile the two sets of experiences educationally can be very important. Now, I recall many years ago when I went from my course where I learned about manufacturing garments into the workplace, and at the end of my course. And for me, the experience was one of dissonance, that I just couldn't see anything that I'd learned in the course applying to what I was asked to do in the workplace. It is as though I hadn't done a course. The knowledge I'd learned from that didn't seem to apply. And it was only years later that I realized that there was a lot of transference across, a lot of utilization of that knowledge. But because the physical setting and the social setting and the activities seemed so different, that it wasn't immediately obvious. So anything we can do to assist the students realize the links between what is being taught and what is being required from work practice can be helpful. And that also gets across this dissonance between theory and practice, which is quite unhelpful. And emphasize the active and selective qualities of students learning through workplaces. So by engaging students in critically appraising their experiences, that sets them up for being active and considered learners in the workplace. But it also provides a foundation then for their ongoing development across working life. That if they set up and develop personal epistemologies that will allow them to critically appraise, make decisions, draw upon expertise, that's a very, very important learning habit that they will need across working lives. And it would seem, as I've said, that when I look across these experiences, what we do before, during, and after, that these post-practicum interventions seem to be the most potent, seem to be the most important. And that is because the students have had experiences, they've got something to discuss, share, compare, contrast, and critically appraise, as I've mentioned. So In a recent study, which is just finished, this was the focus, and this was the focus of augmenting students' learning experience through post-practicum educational processes. That is, when students have had that experiences, how this could be linked to develop their capacities and promote their employability. And this project was involved a developmental conference where in the first phase we brought 14 teams of people together to discuss how their projects would go across the fields of health and social care. And then once they'd completed those year-long projects, they came and presented at a dialogue forum to people from another 30 projects. So over 40 projects across 19 universities, 23 disciplines. And then in the second round, these projects were then enacted. So trialing 14 different approaches in health and social care, and then seeing how those processes would be applicable to a range of other disciplines outside of, but including health and social care. And so a variety of approach was adopted to secure these post-practicum outcomes. This included feedback, learning circles, debriefs, etc. And we also undertook a student survey to gauge what students wanted from these experiences and how they wanted those experiences to occur. And I have that material elsewhere, it's all been published. But what I thought would be useful is to provide a couple of examples of the kind of strategies that were used. And here's a long list of the strategies that we used in round one. And these are from, as I said, health and social services, and were a range of strategies that we used. And part of the concern was to try and make this authentic, to try and provide activities which are related to the kinds of knowledge and practices which these people would have to develop. Let me take a few examples. So in the first one, this was about nursing and helping nurses develop critical clinical reasoning skills. Now, rather than writing statements out, which the students initially did, in this post-practicum experience, what the students were encouraged to do was to provide an oral presentation of the patient's case, the patient's circumstances, and how they as a nurse would respond to it. Now, the point here is that it required still the kind of thinking that's necessary for those tasks, but also by taking an oral presentation rather than a written assignment, what was done there was to capture what actually happens in healthcare settings, because nurses have to be able to talk with other nurses, other healthcare professions about the patient, about their diagnosis, about the kind of treatments they're having and how those treatments are progressing. In another example, this was called professional exchanges. This was with medical students, and the medical students were brought together and there was information provided to them that was necessary. Medical students, by the way, are the most time jealous of students, they tell us, because they have so many commitments associated with their education. So the students were brought together and they were allowed then to discuss some issues, and then they went into small groups where they were asked to consider issues that they'd recently encountered in their workplace practicum processes, and in small groups, in the safety of those small groups, and the teacher was absent from them, they were able to discuss and share with their other students, perhaps mistakes they'd made, bad experiences they'd had, good experiences they'd had. And then at the end, there was a discussion of those so that there could be some sharing across the cohort. And in another project, which was about, again, nurse education, this was a structured learning circles that allowed the the nurses to talk again, nursing students to talk again in psychological safety, small groups, and they could share their experiences, and they could engage in activities such as developing concept maps about what they'd experienced, and share amongst each other the experiences they'd had, and draw upon their peers' experiences, and to compare and contrast those. And then there was a structured clinical debrief tutorials. This was in medicine, for medical students, and this provided an opportunity on an afternoon session for the medical students to come together to discuss their various rotations. And medical students have these examinations at the end of the year, which cover all of the specialisms that they've engaged in. And this was provide an opportunity for them to discuss with others their experiences that they might have had quite early in the year and needed insights and fresh considerations of as they moved across the year and rotated through a series of different wards within hospital settings. And so this provided, again, a safe and secure environment. The tutors stood back and let the students discuss, but were there to take questions and queries about clinical practice. So what were the outcomes from these? Well, here there's a list of outcomes that arose from these kind of projects. And I'll just pick out a few. So from when I mentioned about the nurses doing the oral presentation, what was suggested that firstly the students thought this was a good approach. It gave them good skills and it helped them be more practiced in clinical reasoning and being able to articulate their reasons. And it was seen that this was more effective and helpful for patient safety and patient care because the students had developed those capacities. In the case of the medical students doing the structured experiences, it was suggested both by what the students reported and observation that the students engage highly effectively and effortfully in these activities. Julia Harrison, who ran this project, said that as soon as the students went into the groups, the volume of discussion and the engagement was very intense, and the students were really keen to share and compare and contrast their experiences and to be able to report mistakes they've made as well, but in the safety of a peer group. And that this was an environment in which they could come to develop those skills. And of course, again, these are the very skills and the need to talk and consult with others, which is a hallmark, an important quality of medical practitioners, what doctors do, of consult widely before making decisions. So this in some sense set up an experience which developed the kind of clinical skills which doctors need. But then coming down to one I haven't mentioned so far, Christy Noble's studies of engaging students in developing the skills to seek feedback and to utilize feedback effectively. And students reported high levels of satisfaction with this and understanding the process of feedback as not just something where it's about giving them grades, but also how they can learn that and how they could work with and secure feedback that was effective for their particular purposes. So there were very specific intentions here, and students reported positive outcomes from them. So you'll see that across these projects, there were very different kind of purposes to be achieved, distinct purposes. And so the particular experience was aligned with achieving those purposes, and then there was an evaluation of whether those purposes were important. Okay, so that's the talk finished. And then Laurent will guide you now through activity 4, which is a consideration of how the integration of these experiences and how that might be helpful for your educational program, and if it's occurring, how it's being enacted. So I wish you well with that activity, and hopefully it will be a productive experience for you. Thank you.